Let's talk about Palestine and why more countries are recognizing it as a state.
Canada intends to recognize
the State of Palestine
as a contribution to a proper peace process.
To initiate this political momentum is the only path to peace.
The peace they envision is the two-state solution, i.e. the State of Palestine and the State of Israel living alongside each other. It's been talked about for decades, but it's further away than ever.
אנחנו נמשיך לבנות מציאות יהודית מגשימה. המציאות הזו קוברת סופית את רעיון המדינה הפלסטינית. פשוט כי אין במה להכיר ואין למי להכיר.
Are these states that are recognizing the State of Palestine going to do anything to stop Israel from building and expanding settlements? Are they going to do anything to stop Israel from continuing this genocide? For me, this looks very much like a fig leaf.
So what does it actually mean for these countries to recognize a Palestinian state now? And what, if anything, does it change? A lot of countries already recognize the State of Palestine. The total stood at 147 in August. At least 6 more said they would recognize it at this year's UN General Assembly meeting. They include the UK and France, both permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as Canada and Australia.
The new wave, though, is important for a lot of reasons, because it's coming from countries that have been very supportive of Israel and also wealthy countries that have influence with Israel, in particular European countries.
So why is this happening now? Well, one explanation is that they're responding to growing anger about Israel's genocide in Gaza.
They're doing it now because they feel the heat of the public. They're continuing their relations with Israel. In most cases, they're continuing their trade relations with Israel, and the public's angry.
They are trying to find a backhanded way of holding Israel accountable.
Israel has killed at least 64,500 Palestinians in Gaza since October 2023. More than half of those killed were women and children. The Israeli army's own data suggests that 83% of those killed were civilians, according to an investigation by The Guardian and 2 other news organizations. More than 163,000 have been injured, and more than 2 million people have been displaced. Much of Gaza has been turned into rubble, and now there's a famine because Israel has blocked the entry of food and other supplies.
It is a famine openly promoted by some Israeli leaders as a weapon of war.
The conditions on the ground are overwhelming in their depiction of the carnage and the massive human suffering that is there. That's built up large domestic constituencies in each of these global north countries that something must be done. And the something that must be done is the next, if you like, low-hanging fruit on the diplomatic tree would be to recognize Palestine.
Now, there's a lot of debate about what recognizing the State of Palestine actually means for Palestinians. One way that people are looking at it is that it's an important symbolic step, which in itself has value.
So recognition is a first step. It's not a final step. It's just a first meaningful, significant step in an international momentum to implement the two-state solution rather than negotiate it.
In a way, this wave could refocus attention to international law, very important. It could also have some legal implications. If you recognize the State of Palestine, each state might have to follow through with certain things related to its relationship with Israel, relationship with occupied territories.
But what does it even mean for a country to recognize a state? Well, in theory, it means that a country formally acknowledges another as a sovereign and independent entity. But there's no universal rulebook that defines what it means for a state to exist. There is a legal framework under international law that's often used as a reference point, and it sets out 4 criteria for statehood. These are having a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Now, many international law experts agree that Palestine does meet the criteria. But some of these new countries recognizing Palestine have emphasized that they're making more of a political judgment than a legal one. Some of these countries have also added conditions to their recognition of Palestinian statehood, which has been criticized. For example, Canada and Australia say their recognition is partly based on a commitment they've received from the Palestinian Authority, which controls only some parts of Palestinian territory, to hold elections next year, and that Hamas cannot take part.
What is the idea of having independence? It's not having people decide for you. It's not having people decide who leads you.
Why is it that all of this conditionality is being placed on Palestinians and not being placed on Israel? They haven't put any such conditions on any of the Israeli political parties. And when it's today, it's these political parties that are carrying out genocide. That's the part that is so deeply racist.
Meanwhile, the UK has made its recognition of Palestine dependent on what Israel does, saying it will go ahead with recognition unless
the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution.
Palestinians should be free irrespective of what Israel is doing now, and what these countries should be doing instead of perhaps using it as a threat to Israel for Israel to stop the genocide is that they should just be putting sanctions on Israel to stop the genocide. And they should have recognized that Palestinians have a right to freedom long, long, long ago.
بتوقع هي خطوة متأخرة ومتأخرة كتير ولأنها كانت ثمنها غالي كتير.
فنتمنى يكون هذا شيء بصالحنا وصالح أهل غزة وصالح فلسطين كافة طبعا. يعني ممكن هذا يكون في ضغط دولي سواء على إسرائيل على أمريكا.
أي اعتراف بيجي بيعترف فينا كدولة وكحق لشعبنا الفلسطيني احنا بنرحب في هذه الخطوة.
هذا حق لنا كفلسطينيين وهو ليس منا. ليس من بريطانيا أو غيرها من الدول.
And on top of all of that is the question about the borders of Palestine and exactly what territory these countries are recognizing. Because so far, none of them have been explicit about that. These are the borders of Israel that most of the world recognizes. And then you've got the Palestinian territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. That's broadly seen as the land that would make up a Palestinian state under a two-state solution. How we even ended up with these borders is very contentious because the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 led to more than 700,000 Palestinians being expelled from their homes and land. We've gone into detail about all of that in our episode explaining the two-state solution. We'll put a link to it in the comments. Now, those Palestinian territories have been under a military occupation by Israel since the war in 1967. So Israel has almost total control over Palestinian life, and it enforces a system of discrimination that many describe as apartheid. Plus, over the years, Israel has been seizing more land by building settlements. These are Jewish residential communities with their own facilities like schools and roads, which Palestinians are excluded from. Today, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. That's about 10% of the Jewish Israeli population. It's created a reality on the ground, which means the map of Palestinian territory today actually looks like this, totally carved up by settlements.
The whole purpose of setting them up was to put a flag of Israeli sovereignty on Palestinian soil to ensure that there never would be the possibility of Palestinian self-determination. Every single new settler is another stake in the heart of the possibility of a Palestinian state.
They're not just building and expanding settlements, but the Israelis, and in particular Israeli settlers, have been carrying out acts of terrorism to try to get Palestinians off their land. So it's been everything from setting Palestinian homes and orchards on fire to issuing demolition orders with entire communities that have now been completely ethnically cleansed from their homes.
During the first half of 2025, there were more than 750 settler attacks that resulted in Palestinian casualties or property damage, and settlers are often protected by the Israeli army. Over the decades, there have been a bunch of UN resolutions on the illegality of Israel's occupation and the building of settlements. Plus, last year, the UN's top court, the International Court of Justice, issued clear legal guidance that Israel must end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, including stopping all settlement activity and removing the settlers already there.
The advisory opinion coming in July 2024 from the International Court of Justice made it very clear that the State of Palestine has sovereignty over all of the occupied territory, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and in fact, where the borders existed prior to June 6, 1967. Now, when they say they're recognizing a Palestinian state, I haven't heard any of these countries mention that they are recognizing Palestine within those borders.
What I think is going to happen in the case of Palestine is they're going to recognize a state, but they're not going to recognize sovereignty, which is to say that they're not going to say that Palestinians have a right to kick out each and every one of those settlers that has stolen Palestinian land, that is living on Palestinian land illegally. I don't think that that's what they're going to be recognizing, when in reality, that is exactly what they should be recognizing.
And this is why there is a lot of skepticism that this new wave of recognition of a Palestinian state will actually lead to any meaningful change. So much depends on whether these countries are willing to put more pressure on Israel and enforce international law. And the track record on that is pretty weak. Even during the height of the so-called peace process between Israelis and Palestinians in the 1990s, Israel was supposed to stop building settlements. Instead, it kept adding more.
During the whole time of its 58-year-old occupation, it has paid very little political cost on the international level for this. If countries are actually willing to use the big cards in their diplomatic toolbox, we would see, I think, a decisive change in Israeli behavior. I think, first of all, it calls for suspension of all weapons sales to Israel. It means suspending the many, many free trade agreements that countries have created with Israel. It means trying to discourage investment in Israel. In other words, probably to enforce it to become a pariah until it brings itself back within the good graces of international law.
The recognition cannot be just verbal and in and of itself. It has to be accompanied by real measurable steps. It may be really no longer possible to have two states, but what is very important is to focus on the international law, because whatever outcome that takes place in Israel-Palestine has to be built on the principle of freedom for all and equality for all. And short of that, no outcome is going to be meaningful.
Here's the link to our two-state solution episode. There's lots of information there about the history of Israel and Palestine and why lots of people think the two-state solution is dead, even though politicians keep talking about it. And if you want to know more about international law, watch this.